Before I get started here, I want to say that we know that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but it's also true that extraordinary evidence takes time. So this may take a little time. First, I'm going to just give the theory, and some of this I'm going to read rather than trying to remember it. Charles Dickens amalgamated two existing works by Mathew Franklin Whittier, one of them possibly written in collaboration with his wife Abby, to create the story of the Goblins who stole the Sexton. And that's from the Pickwick Papers. It's the Christmas 29th chapter of the Pickwick Papers. And he secularized his version. And one of these two existing stories he would almost definitely have seen as much as 8 months before he published that. Now here's the background briefly. Mathew Franklin Whittier, signing as Trismegistus, publishes a story called The Unbidden Guest in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in Scotland in the April 1836 edition. Now, that's something that scholars say that Dickens, they can't prove that he read Edinburgh's, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that he did. So almost certainly he read that story in several months before he came out with a story about the Goblins and the Sexton. The second is Charles Dickens publishes the 29th chapter of the Pickwick Papers in December of 1836, entitled The Story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton. And that plot is foreshadowed at the end of the previous chapter, 28, but almost certainly before he wrote either of those, he would have seen these two stories. 3. Francis A. Duravage publishes The New Year's Bells, one of these two stories, in a compilation entitled The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. It was plagiarized from Mathew Franklin Whittier's portfolio in early 1848, which I've gone into before. By style, I estimate it to have been written by Mathew, possibly, again, in collaboration with Abby, somewhere in the somewhere in the first half of 1836. I'm guessing around 1832, but it could have been later. I seriously doubt it was written after Charles Dickens published this chapter of the Pickwick Papers. 4. Dickens would almost certainly have seen The Unbidden Guest, again, as I've said. But it's speculation that he saw The New Year's Bells. I extrapolate that because there's such clear elements, in my opinion, of each of those stories in Goblins. And Mathew and Abby appear to have used The New Year's Bells, but not The Unbidden Guest, as more or less a template for their original version of A Christmas Carol, which Dickens then reworked. So I've been over all that before. Now, what we definitely know is that Dickens almost certainly would have read The Unbidden Guest several months before foreshadowing the story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton in chapter 28 of the Pickwick Papers, and then releasing the story in the 29th chapter in December of 1836. Secondly, there are elements in Dickens' story which seem to have been drawn from both of these stories. And thirdly, there is one element in the Goblins which is not in either of these two stories, but which does show up in A Christmas Carol, though that element may also have been drawn from Mathew and Abby's personal life, and there's also a lot of parallels in Abby's own short stories, all of which were written before A Christmas Carol came out. So there is the possibility of influence the other way. When Mathew and Abby wrote A Christmas Carol, Mathew was a fan of Dickens, and he would have read the story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton. So theoretically, anything new that Dickens added to that could have influenced Mathew. He prided himself on his originality, but nonetheless, influence is such that you don't always realize you're being influenced. So now I'm going to go into summaries of the plots of each of these three stories. I'm assuming you're familiar with A Christmas Carol, so I won't summarize that. The story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. Sexton, or a gravedigger, Gabriel Grub, is a misanthropic sexton who digs his graves on Christmas Eve, unmindful of the sadness of the families of the dead. This is my description. He is described as, quote, ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly, morose, and lonely. On the way to the churchyard, he hits a caroling boy over the head with his lantern several times to shut him up, which in reality that would really hurt somebody. In the graveyard, he takes pleasure in burying someone at Christmas time, making a joke about the coffin being a, quote, Christmas box. Drinking, he falls asleep on a horizontal tombstone. Goblins appear, cavorting and leaping over tombstones, and the king of the goblins takes him down into the earth to a cave. There, he shows Gabriel a series of scenes, like videos, with the aim of reforming him. They are, first, a father arrives home to his family. They are poor but happy. Second, the youngest child, a boy, dies. Gabriel murmured something about the scene being very pretty, and the goblins kick him. They keep kicking him. 3, a beautiful landscape of a town in the distance in the summer. The goblins kick him again. 4, Gabriel Grub is shown several more scenes, not described individually. Good people suffering but striving to remain cheerful and good. Quote, above all, he saw that men like himself who snarled at the mirth and cheerfulness of others were the foulest weeds on the fair surface of the earth, and setting all the good of the world against the evil, he came to the conclusion that it was a very decent and respectable sort of world after all. This is a secular person imitating a description of a spiritual conversion. It's clear to me. I don't know if it's clear to anybody else. First off, he's condemning such a person as the foulest weed. Well, how can he reform? If that's who he is, essentially, he can't reform. See, so right there, it's oxymoronic. And then your spiritual conversion is just to decide that the world is decent and respectable after all. It's a very poor, secularized knockoff of somebody else's spiritual conversion work. 5, once he is reformed, the goblins faded, and he wakes up in the morning on the flat gravestone. It is inferred that he had been drinking because his liquor bottle is empty. He leaves the area, 6, he leaves the area, and a myth develops that he had been taken away by the goblins, though he returns as an old man. And I've written that this reads like a paranormal account debunked by a skeptic, with grudging praise for the idea of personal reformation, sounding vaguely spiritual, but with no actual references to spirituality. This is Dickens, the secular, worldly man who dumbs down and secularizes spiritual people's work. And I will quote here again Yogi Baba Hari Das, who said, snakes no heart. Now I'm going to go into the summary of the plot of The Unbidden Guest. This is the one signed by Mathew as Trismegistus. I can prove that Trismegistus was Mathew, excuse me, a little bit congested, that Trismegistus was Mathew Franklin Whittier's own signature going back as early as 1828. And then again, he brought it in again in 1851 and so on. So there's no question that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. A wealthy German named Nicholas Clare, who is genial but without compassion for the poor, is visited by the devil disguised as a rogue and a moocher. Mathew hated boors and moochers, who insists on coming in and bullies him, eating everything in the house. When Nicholas tries to escape, the devil chases him to a haunted graveyard. There he sees dancing goblins as well as skeletons and witches. He then catches sight of a sexton digging a grave and runs to him, hoping the man is human. However, it turns out to be the same devil digging his, meaning Nicholas Clare's, own grave. He is pulled down into it, falling and falling until he suddenly wakes up at home on the floor. His dreams are attributed to dyspepsia, or stomach problems, which Mathew wrote about frequently, something he had trouble with, from having overeaten. So the moral here is just don't, be a gluttonous, basically. The reference to the devil is made as by one familiar with religion, but taking that part of it as a myth, and Mathew typically did this. He used the idea of a devil in his humor, although he was raised Quaker and was certainly familiar with religion. Now, the New Year's bells. This first one, The Unbidden Guest, you can say, yeah, there's definitely suspicious similarities between The Unbidden Guest and Goblins. But when you bring the New Year's bells into it, suddenly between the two, you've got an awful lot of elements, way beyond chance. So the summary of this is, on New Year's Eve, A miserly, hard-hearted landlord named Israel Wurm. Notice the parallel between Gabriel Grub and Israel Wurm. So if this story, The New Year's Bells, was written first, you've got an obvious knockoff on the character name of Israel Wurm. If Israel Wurm, W-U-R-M, is first, then Gabriel Grub is an obvious knockoff. On New Year's Eve, a miserly, hard-hearted landlord named Israel Wurm threatens an old lady with 2 sick grandchildren with imminent eviction. The widow's husband was once his best friend in youth, who had been generous with him. When he refuses to relent, the old woman curses him. Israel's walk home takes him through a churchyard where, due to the cold, he falls asleep on a horizontal tombstone, where we heard that before. In his dream, he finds himself in the summer and meets a sexton. We got another sexton digging a grave that turns out to be his own. Well, we'll compare that with A Christmas Carol later. In the dream, he sees a succession of visions. And this is sounding an awful lot like the Goblins and the Sexton. First, he is walking with his best friend, Mark, and they are children again. Mark offers to pay for a pleasure trip to the Boston Common, seeing the shows. Again, we got a parallel with A Christmas Carol, which we'll get into later. 2, he is at a science lecture, and the lecturer is showing projected slides from a microscope. First, he shows the nose of a common housefly. Then there is nothing on the screen, and it turns out to be the soul of a miser, because it's so small you can't see it. Mathew was fascinated by technology. Slideshows did go way, way back to well before 1836. I checked on that. 3, he is suddenly in hell, but then very quickly he is awakened by the sound of the New Year's bells ringing. The townspeople have rescued him, and he is a changed man. He treats the townspeople to a New Year's feast, arranges to have provisions sent to the widow, and helps the poor the rest of his life. Note the phrase in his final speech, quote, heaven willing, which indicates a religious author. This story is more similar to A Christmas Carol in its spiritual tone, suggesting Abby's input. So this is one reason I think that maybe she collaborated on this early story, which they then used as a template for A Christmas Carol. Now, we've got a whole bunch of comparison passages. I don't know, this is pretty thick. I don't know how long this is going to take. I hadn't intended for it to take so long, but the same thing has happened here as has happened in my last video and several others. I've got so much evidence. This is what happened with my books. My books are not long because I just sit here and pontificate like I'm doing now. They're long because I've got so much evidence to share, okay? And again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and extraordinary evidence takes time. If you don't have the motivation, to look at the evidence, then don't pretend that the evidence is not there or it's no good. The problem is you're too lazy to actually look at it all. Okay? I don't mean to be so confrontative, but, it gets very frustrating to me when people act like they say there's no evidence for reincarnation, and the evidence is there. They're too damn lazy to look at it, or too scared to look at it. I don't know which. This is incendiary. This means that Dickens was an imitator, and he borrowed from these 2 stories by this obscure American couple to come up with the Goblins. That's supposed to be his precursor to A Christmas Carol. It wasn't his work. It wasn't his ideas, okay? And A Christmas Carol was never his. He just reworked somebody else's manuscript. I mean, this is the evidence for it, okay? All right, so we're going to compare these pieces. I'm going to read a passage in one, and then I'm going to read a passage in another, and then in Dickens, and then I'm going to go on to the next section, and you'll see the parallels. I don't think I need to really point them out. In The Unbidden Guest, we see, but to say nothing of his moral inferiority, what pleasure, I should like to know, can a rich man possibly derive from a poor one? To laugh at his jokes is out of the question, for who can relish humor that is not endorsed by respectability? If he tells you a fact, 10 to 1 it is a fiction, for poverty is the mother of invention. He's speaking as his character. He cannot rivet your attention by any piquant small scandals about your mutual friends, which is the very salt of conversation, nothing being more remarkable than the placidity with which we listen to the abuse of our acquaintances and the dulcet strain in which we put forth our remonstrances of, quote, come now, this is too bad. I really cannot sit still and hear all this. evidently intending thereby to encourage the speaker to go on. The poor man cannot serve up any sauce picante of this sort, and as for his daring to round off a point by poking you in the ribs, or winking knowingly at you with an arch half-shut eye, those familiar expedients which lend such irresistible effect to purse-proud drollery, why, he would no more think of taking such a liberty than of taking the air on a witch's broomstick. Of necessity, then, the poor man must be as dull as a dog, as he is a depraved one. Such being the case, what wonder that a respectable citizen, like Nicholas Clare, who's wealthy, made a point of keeping the whole fraternity of poor people at arm's length, and restricting himself to the society of his moral and enlightened equals, on whose genial minds his elephantine jokes and still more ponderous commonplaces never failed to make the requisite impression. So he's just setting up the contemptuous attitudes of rich people for the poor. Now in the New Year's bells, crouched near the table, her features dimly lighted by a tallow candle, sat a woman advanced in life, clad in faded but cleanly garments, whose hollow cheeks and sunken eye told a painful tale of sorrow and destitution. Those sad eyes were fixed anxiously and imploringly upon the stern, grim face of a hard-featured old man, who, with hat pulled over his shaggy gray eyebrows, was standing, resting on a stout staff in the center of the floor. "So, you haven't got any money for me," said the old man in the harshest of all possible voices. "Alas, no, Mr. Wurm. If I had, I should have brought it to you long ago," answered the poor woman. "I had raked and scraped a little together, but the sickness of these poor children, poor William's orphans, swept it all away. I haven't got a cent." "So much the worse for you, Mrs. Redmond," answered the old man harshly. "I've been easy with you. I've waited and waited, trusting your promises. I can't wait any longer. I want the money." "You want the money? Is it possible? Report speaks you rich." "It's false, false," said the old man bitterly. "I'm poor. I'm pinched. Ask the townspeople how I live. Do I look like a rich man? No, no, I tell you I want my dues, and I will have 'em." Then in the Goblins, Gabriel Grub was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow, a morose and lonely man who consorted with nobody but himself and an old wicker bottle which fitted into his large, deep waistcoat pocket, and who eyed each merry face as it passed him by with such a deep scowl of malice and ill humor as it was difficult to meet without feeling something the worse for. And then I skipped down a little. Now Gabriel had been looking forward to reaching the dark lane because it was, generally speaking, a nice, gloomy, mournful place, into which the townspeople did not much care to go except in broad daylight, and when the sun was shining. Consequently, he was not a little indignant to hear a young urchin roaring out some jolly song about a Merry Christmas in this very sanctuary, which had been called Coffin Lane ever since the days of the old abbey and the time of the shaven-head monks. As Gabriel walked on and the voice drew nearer, he found it proceeded from a small boy who was hurrying along to join one of the little parties in the old street, and who, partly to keep himself company and partly to prepare for the occasion, was shouting out the song at the highest pitch of his lungs. So Gabriel waited till the boy came up, and then dodged him into a corner and rapped him over the head with his lantern 5 or 6 times, just to teach him to modulate his voice. And as the boy hurried away with his hand to his head, singing quite a different sort of tune, Gabriel Grub chuckled very heartily to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. I have a couple impressions on this. First of all, there's no real respect for Christmas carols in here. In other words, there's no religious reference. He's, shouting it out and at the highest pitch of his lungs, and the reason he's doing it is to keep himself company and get ready for the party. In other words, Dickens has very carefully omitted anything sacred in here. And secondly, in Matthew's fiction, he separates out fantasy from reality in a particular sense. He doesn't have things represented to be real that are impossible, typically. Now, I've seen lanterns that are made of very light tin, contemporary ones, But if I'm not mistaken, lanterns in that day, in 1836, were heavy. They had, glass panes in them and were made of brass. And if you hit a boy over the head with a lantern and swung it, because it hung, if you hit a boy over the head with a lantern 5 or 6 times, you would have killed him. So it's a strange passage. It's like the person writing it is as vicious as the character, Now we're going to go to another comparison. This is from the Unbidden Guest. By this time they were close under the low wall of a churchyard which lies away from the more frequented tract, in the heart of a flat open country, just 3 miles from Ingolstadt. Everyone knows, or should know, the spot to which I allude. It is of semicircular form, something like a horseshoe, and being peopled by local tradition with 1,000 phantom tenants. Not a citizen who has any regard for his salvation will venture near it after nightfall. Notice there's a reference to salvation. Just a little thing, but you're not going to see that in Dickens. Leastwise, not in the Goblins. A curse is said to be on it. No flower springs up within its circuit. The very grass just acquires a sort of starveling growth, then rots and dies. Nothing lives but the deadly henbane, beneath whose shade the soft mottled toad lies couched, or a few lean, shrunken, discontented yews, which look just as if they were planted by some goblin zoologist by way of a quiz upon vegetation. Arrived at this forlorn spot, which was made still more cheerless by the spectral waving to and fro of the yews, and the sickly light of the yellow moon which now began to pour down a dim, reluctant radiance, poor Nicholas, shuddering from head to foot, for too well he knew his whereabouts, made another desperate attempt at a retreat, but in vain. He was riveted to the spot like an epic poet to the windows of a cook shop, while, to compel him to an onward movement, his pursuer, the devil, is chasing him to the graveyard, making an extempore spring on his back, and clasping him tightly around his neck with both arms, began to spur away at his haunches with such uncommon vivacity that, goaded to supernatural exertions, he made one last convulsive essay and cleared the low wall in a style that would have electrified the most accomplished leaper of the 6-foot club, his goblin rider bearing conscientious testimony to his nimbleness by belling out, "Oh, rare, there was a jump. Stop, Nick, we are at home at last." Note the leaping here. Our Ingolstadt velocipede is now fairly within the haunted enclosure, and though his demon persecutor has vanished, others and more appalling objects still remain to bewilder him. In whatever direction he looked, there he saw the ghastly mixed with the grotesque, and the material with the immaterial, just as he had so often met with them in those legendary tales of which the Germans of all classes are so fond. The graves about him stirred with life. Spectral forms flung down threatening glances upon him from the populous branches of the yews. Skeleton faces kept popping up behind every tombstone, and the winding lizard crept out from amidst the rank luxuriance of the henbane, its burnished scales flashing and glowing with 1,000 gorgeous colors beneath the meteoric radiance of the corpse candles which traversed the Lazar house in every direction. Here, in one place, a group of grinning hobgoblins were pirouetting and bobbing to each other and cutting such incredible capers that I can only compare them to those practiced in the Highland fling during the briskest paroxysms of that picturesque saltation. And just outside the aisle, 2 monumental knights in armor, whose united ages might have amounted to some 400 years and odd, stood bolt upright, staring at Nicholas with upraised arms, as if waving him a grim welcome home. But what shocked the good man worse than all was the sight of a grisly old witch with a beard as black as your hat, ogling a carved Dutch cherub who had just sprung into animation on the head of a tombstone, while another, equally stubby, was waltzing with a sprightly skeleton on the marble slab of a cenotaph. And as the engaging creature twirled, rattling round her in the dance, she smirked and simpered with a breadth of grin that would have won the heart of an Eskimo. Now, note in particular the dancing goblins. Now, in the New Year's Bells, just a short passage. The illuminated disk grew dark and disappeared. Then a lurid light seemed to fill all space, and soon huge billows of flames rolled upward and writhed and twisted together like a myriad of gigantic serpents. Shrieks and howls of anguish issued from the fiery mass, but above all was heard the startling clangor of a bell. This is clearly hell. That character has landed in hell, even though it's very brief. Now in The Goblins, it's by Dickens. As the goblin laughed, the sexton observed for one instant a brilliant illumination within the windows of the church, as if the whole building were lighted up. It disappeared, the organ pealed forth a lively air, and whole troops of goblins, the very counterpart of the first one, poured into the churchyard and began playing at leapfrog with the tombstones, never stopping for an instant to take breath, but overing the highest among them, one after the other, with the most marvelous dexterity. The first goblin was a most astonishing leaper, and none of the others could come near him. Even in the extremity of his terror, the sexton could not help observing that while his friends were content to leap over the common-sized gravestones, the first took the family vaults, iron railings and all, with as much ease as if they had been so many street posts. So it looks very suspiciously as though Dickens has amalgamated a couple elements from The Unbidden Guest. The first one being that with the devil on his back, the protagonist, Nicholas Clare, has leaped over a wall. And the second being that in that story, the goblins were dancing, which is really much more interesting than them leaping over tombstones. Now, we're going to another comparison. This is from The Unbidden Guest. While Nick thus stood transfixed and spellbound, he saw in a remote corner of the charmed semicircle a man busy digging a grave and throwing up at every lift of his spade a load that might have killed a dray horse. The sight of this figure, possibly mortal like himself, inspired him with sudden courage. His heart yearned towards him, and in an instant he was by his side. What's interesting about that is that that is the way astral travel works. So possibly, I don't know if Abby had any input into this, but Matthew may have read about astral travel. You think and you're there. But what words can express his rage, his loathing, his despair, when in his hideous lineaments he recognized his unbidden guest? This is the devil. The fiend's eyes were fastened on him with the benumbing power of the basilisk, and, flinging aside his spade, while a ghastly grin wrinkled his countenance, he thundered in the burgher's ear, "Nick, welcome home!" Instantly the spell of silence that had so long hung like a heavy air over the charnel house was broken. The old church bell began tolling. Strange forms, apparelled in winding sheets, sung funeral anthems among the clouds, and, while 1,000 infernal voices took up and prolonged the cry of "Welcome home," a legion of fiends, each as material as a Glasgow Bailey, gathered around the crazed burgher, made busy preparations for precipitating him into the black abyss. See, they're going to pull him down into the grave. So note this plot development that he's going to be pulled down into a hole in the ground. Now from the Goblins, at last the game reached to a most exciting pitch. The organ played quicker and quicker, and the goblins leaped faster and faster, coiling themselves up, rolling head over heels upon the ground, and bounding over the tombstones like footballs. The sexton's brain reeled beneath him as the spirits flew before his eyes, when the Goblin King suddenly, darting towards him, laid his hand upon his collar and sank with him through the earth. So here again we have, the protagonist with the goblin sinking into the earth. See? It's not very different. So now we're going to go to another comparison. This is from the New Year's Bells. Grove and schoolhouse passed away, melting into another scene like one of the dissolving views. Israel stood before a huge illuminated screen in the midst of a gaping company of sightseers. He could see nothing but a confused mass of heads, vaguely lighted by the rays from that vast screen. It was some kind of an exhibition. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," said a strange voice issuing from the darkness, "we shall show you the wonders of the oxyhydrogen microscope. Natural objects magnified 5,000 times. Look and behold the proboscis of the common housefly." Israel gazed with the rest, and soon a huge object resembling the trunk of a monster elephant appeared on the illuminated disk. It passed away. Now, ladies and gentlemen, said the voice, look well to the illuminated screen. What do you see now? Nothing, was the universal and indignant answer. I thought so, replied the voice. Yet you have before you a miser's soul magnified 5,000 times. 1,000,000 such would not produce an image on the screen. Now, Matthew was always fascinated by technology, and he was religious. So we have here a reference to the soul and technology. They did have those kind of slideshows very early. I forget when I looked it up. I think it's like 1828 or something. They go back to 1830 or somewhere, well before this was published. Now, in the Goblins by Dickens. And now, said the king, fantastically poking the taper corner of his sugarloaf hat into the sexton's eyes, and thereby occasioning him the most exquisite pain, and now show the man of misery and gloom a few of the pictures from our own great storehouse. I'm going to stop here for a second. We have here goblins trying to reform a man. You know, it doesn't make any sense. It's oxymoronic just from the get-go that the goblins would be trying to reform somebody. As the goblin said this, a thick cloud, which obscured the farther end of the cavern, this is where he was taken down into the earth, rolled gradually away and disclosed, apparently at a great distance, a small and scantily furnished but neat and clean apartment. A crowd of little children were gathered round a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown and gambolling round her chair. The mother occasionally rose and drew aside the window curtains as if to look for some expected object. A frugal meal was ready spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. A knock was heard at the door. The mother opened it, and the children crowded round her and clapped their hands for joy as their father entered. He was wet and weary, and shook the snow from his garments as the children crowded round him, and seizing his cloak, hat, stick, and gloves with busy zeal, ran with them from the room. Then, as he sat down to his meal before the fire, the children climbed about his knee, and the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. But a change came upon the view almost imperceptibly. The scene was altered to a small bedroom, where the fairest and youngest child lay dying. The roses had fled from his cheek, and the light from his eye, and even as the sexton looked upon him with an interest he had never felt or known before, he died. His young brothers and sisters crowded round his little bed, and seized his tiny hand so cold and heavy, but they shrunk back from its touch, and looked with awe on his infant face, for calm and tranquil as it was, sleeping in rest and peace as the beautiful child seemed to be, they saw that he was dead, and they knew that he was an angel, looking down upon them and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. Again, the light cloud passed across the picture, and again the subject changed. The father and mother were old and helpless now, and the number of those about them was diminished more than half, but content and cheerfulness sat on every face and beamed in every eye as they crowded round the fireside and told and listened to old stories of earlier and bygone days. Now, a couple comments on this. First of all, this is one element, this business of the father coming home from work to his family is not in either of the two stories that were written by Matthew or Mathew and Abby. It's not in the Unbidden Guest, and it's not in the New Year's Bells. It does show up in A Christmas Carol. So this could be original to Dickens. However, these elements do figure in Mathew and Abby's personal life, and they also figure in Abby's stories. So Matthew was a fan of Dickens. He would have read The Sexton by the time he and Abby worked on A Christmas Carol starting in 1838. It could have influenced him and then shown up in A Christmas Carol, which Dickens then reworked. Dickens could have put it in himself. So it's hard to say, but this is definitely one element that doesn't show up in either of those two stories. And as I mentioned when I talked about this in an earlier entry, again, there's something strange about this scene, that the brothers and sisters would seize his tiny hand so cold and heavy. Well, again, this isn't realistic because it wouldn't be cold when he just died, and it wouldn't be heavy. There's no reason why a dead child's hand is heavy, and they wouldn't be shocked by it. They wouldn't pull back, shrunk back from its touch. They wouldn't have done that. It's just not realistic at all. Whereas Matthew, I think, was pretty careful about those kinds of things. He didn't want anything that was obviously unrealistic in what was supposed to be literal. Now, where Dickens ends this paragraph, and they knew that he was an angel looking down upon and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. This is Dickens trying to sound religious. But, even Christians, I think, wouldn't say that the instant a child dies, he's now an angel looking down upon and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. And it's not going to happen like that instantly. And certainly anybody who's conversant with spiritualist principles and occult principles knows it doesn't happen like that, that you go through a process of going to the other side or being brought to the other side, and you go through an adjustment process on the other side, and at some point, you become a guiding or guardian spirit, see? But it doesn't happen instantly, seconds after the child has died. So this is an indication that Dickens is faking it. But it's especially important because in A Christmas Carol, there's a great deal of authentic occult teachings, which was there because of Abby, okay, because she had studied primarily. But this can't be a precursor to A Christmas Carol, because the person that wrote this story doesn't know what he's talking about, and whoever wrote A Christmas Carol did. Now we're going to go to another comparison. This is the Unbidden Guest. In vain, Nicholas kicked, scratched, pinched, and even butted like a goat at his assailants. His strength was fast leaving him, and a sly, unhandsome blow in the sirloin, planted by his unbidden guest while he was manually reproving a squat goblin who had seriously inconvenienced him by the scandalous intemperance of his assault and battery, put an end to the engagement by sending him head over heels into the pit. Down, down he plunged till he woke to find himself sprawling on the floor, and the cat, whom he had half crushed in his fall, mewing viciously, with her tail as thick as a bedpost, close beside him. So we have the protagonist waking up from his dream. And note that he's been physically fighting the goblins, whereas in Dickens' version, the goblins just kick him and he doesn't do anything to respond, but not quite as realistic as Matthew's version, where he's fighting the goblins. Now, in the New Year's bells, the comparison here is that they wake up from a dream in each story. The illuminated disc grew dark and disappeared. We've read this before. Then a lurid light seemed to fill all space, and soon huge billows of flames rolled upward and writhed and twisted together like a myriad of gigantic serpents. Shrieks and howls of anguish issued from the fiery masses in hell, but above all was heard the startling clangor of a bell. "Hello, who's this?" cried a voice that evidently issued from a set of powerful human lungs. The miser felt himself roughly shaken by the shoulder and awoke. So he's also woken up from a dream. Now in the Goblins, the day had broken when Gabriel Grub awoke and found himself lying at full length on the flat gravestone in the churchyard, with the wicker bottle lying empty by his side, and his coat, spade, lantern, all well whitened by the last night's frost, scattered on the ground. So Gabriel Grub also had been sleeping and by inference was drunk, and had also been lying on a horizontal tombstone and has just woken up. Now, there is one caveat to all this. I haven't read the German tales, so there may be German tales that precede all of these that have these plot elements. But I seriously doubt it's a coincidence. They're too on point. So now we're going to another element here, another comparison. This is from the New Year's Bells. In the course of the evening, an old Scotch gardener gave it as his opinion that the miser was fey. When a man suddenly changes his character, as when a spendthrift becomes saving, or a niggard generous, the Scotch say that he is fey, and consider the change a forerunner of sudden death. "No, my friend," said Israel, overhearing the remark, "I am not fey, and I mean to live a long while, heaven willing, for I have just learned that the true secret of enjoying life is to do good to others. I had a dream tonight which has, I trust, made me a wiser and better man. The miser lies buried in yonder churchyard. Israel Wurm, a new man, has risen in his place, and as far as my means go, I intend that this shall be a happy new year to every one of my acquaintances." So this is his conversion, his change of heart. Note that there's a phrase, heaven willing. It's a little tiny phrase, but it indicates a religious person. Now in Goblins, many a time the cloud went and came, and many a lesson it taught to Gabriel Grub, who, although his shoulders smarted with pain from the frequent applications of the goblin's feet thereunto, looked on with an interest which nothing could diminish. He saw that men who worked hard and earned their scanty bread with lives of labor were cheerful and happy, and that to the most ignorant the sweet face of nature was a never-failing source of cheerfulness and joy. He saw those who had been delicately nurtured and tenderly brought up, cheerful under privations and superior to suffering that would have crushed many a rougher grain, because they bore within their own bosoms the materials of happiness, contentment, and peace. He saw that women, the tenderest and most fragile of all God's creatures, were the oftenest superior to sorrow, adversity, and distress, and he saw that it was because they bore in their own hearts an inexhaustible wellspring of affection and devotedness. Above all, he saw that men like himself, who snarled at the mirth and cheerfulness of others, here we are again, were the foulest weeds on the fair surface of the earth, and setting all the good of the world against the evil, he came to the conclusion that it was a very decent and respectable sort of world after all. No sooner had he formed it than the cloud which had closed over the last picture seemed to settle on his senses and lull him to repose. One by one the goblins faded from his sight, and as the last one disappeared, he sunk to sleep. So there is a reference to God's creatures, but basically this is kind of the poor man's version of a conversion. It's a secularized conversion. See, I mean, and look at the rationale, the reason. People who have been treated well as children, handle suffering better. And women are often superior to sorrow and adversity. And because they have in their own hearts an inexhaustible wellspring of affection and devotedness, which is sort of spiritual in its way, and so on. You could say it's a spiritual point of view, but I'd say it's a knockoff by a worldly man of a spiritual point of view. Now, we come to comparing the New Year's bells with a Christmas carol, and I'm just going to read these and maybe comment a little bit, but they're pretty in-your-face obvious. I have asserted the similarities so many times. I think people just assume that they can't be that close, and they don't go back and look at it themselves. They don't do the work, too lazy. So I'm going to do the work for them. But you see, this is at the end of a video, which is now, without editing, 45 minutes. So those lazy people aren't going to hear this because they won't get to this point in the video. I think it's nature's way of protecting people from what they're not ready for. But anyway, this is from a New Year's Bells. A fire of chips and brushwood was smoldering on the hearth. In one corner of the room, near the fireplace, on a heap of straw covered with a blanket, two little boys lay sleeping in each other's arms. Crouched near the table, her features dimly lighted by a tallow candle, sat a woman advanced in life, clad in faded but cleanly garments, whose hollow cheeks and sunken eye told a painful tale of sorrow and destitution. Those sad eyes were fixed anxiously and imploringly upon the stern, grim face of a hard-featured old man, who, with hat pulled over his shaggy gray eyebrows, was standing, resting on a stout staff in the center of the floor. "So, you haven't got any money for me," said the old man in the harshest of all possible voices. "Alas, no, Mr. Wurm. If I had, I should have brought it to you long ago," answered the poor woman. "I had raked and scraped a little together, but the sickness of these poor children, poor William's orphans, swept it all away. I haven't got a cent." "So much the worse for you, Mrs. Redmond," answered the old man harshly. "I've been easy with you. I've waited and waited, trusting your promises. I can't wait any longer. I want the money." Now to A Christmas Carol. "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often, quote, came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Now, this is not Charles Dickens writing. He, reworked it and revised it and added things and so on, mostly to kind of puff it out, if you look at the original handwritten draft of Dickens. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier improving on his earlier writing. But Matthew loved puns, and this is a pun. They often came down handsomely in Scrooge never did. That's a typical Matthew-type pun. I forgot this one, so I'm going to add it as audio. "My goods," said the poor woman, looking round her with a melancholy smile. "Why, I have nothing but what few things you see in this room. You surely wouldn't take those." "I'll take all I can get." "And leave me here with the bare walls." "No, no, you walk out of this tomorrow. In the depth of winter, you cannot be so hard-hearted. We shall see that. I care not for myself, but what is to become of these poor children? Send 'em to work in the factory." "But they are just recovering from sickness. They are too young to work. Oh, where can we go?" "To the poorhouse," said the landlord fiercely. That's New Year's bells. Now we go to A Christmas Carol. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds and thousands are in want of common comfort, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the Union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are." "Still," returned the gentleman, "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." Okay, so we move to another comparison, the New Year's bells. "The miser's path lay through the churchyard, a desolate place enough even in the gay noon of a midsummer day, now doubly repulsive in the wild midnight of midwinter. The wall was ruinous. The black iron gateway frowned, naked and ominous." Then in A Christmas Carol, "The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold." So, what we have here, this is not Dickens kind of loosely pulling in elements. This is Matthew actually drawing from his own template. So the parallels are going to be even more stark here. Now, in New Year's bells, "My friend, for whom are you digging that grave?" asked Israel. The sexton looked up from his work, but did not seem to recognize the spokesman. "For a man that died last night, he is to be buried today." "Methinks this haste is somewhat indecorous," said Israel Wurm. "Oh, for the matter of that," said the sexton, "the sooner this fellow's out of the way, the better. There's nobody to mourn for him." "Is he a pauper, then?" "Oh, no, he was immensely rich." "And had he no relations, no friends?" "For relations, he had a nephew who inherits all his property. The young dog will make the money fly, I tell you. As for friends, he had none. The poor dreaded him, the good despised him, for he was a hard-hearted, selfish, gripping man. In a word, he was a miser," said the sexton. "A miser," faltered the trembling dreamer. "What was his name?" "Israel Wurm," replied the sexton. Then we go to A Christmas Carol. I think you already know where I'm going with this. "The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced toward it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape." "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead, said Scrooge. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Now this passage where Scrooge is waxing philosophical, that's Abby's prose, I'm pretty sure. That would be Abby's writing, not Matthew's. Now we go to the New Year's bells. Graveyard and sexton faded away. In their place arose a splendid grove of trees, a clearing, a village schoolhouse. Two boys were sauntering along the roadside, engaged in serious, childish talk. This is part of the visions that Israel Wurm's being shown. One was fair with golden locks, the other dark-haired and grave of aspect. Israel started, for in the latter he recognized himself, a boy of 50 years ago. Israel, said the golden-haired boy, it's election day tomorrow. We'll hire Browning's horse and chaise and go to Boston and have a grand time on the common seeing all the shows. You forget, Mark, said the dark-haired boy sadly, that I have no money. What of that, replied the other. I have a pocketful, and what's mine is yours, you know. Come, cheer up. You'll one day be as rich as I am, and then it will be your turn to treat, you know. I can afford to be generous, and so would you be if you had the means. So in the visions that Israel Wurm is experiencing in his dream, he sees himself and his young friend as they were in happier days. This may ring a bell for you. We turn to A Christmas Carol. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. I was apprenticed here. They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart. It's Fezziwig alive again. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick. Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Now we go to the New Year's bells. I was overcome by drowsiness, answered Israel. I was very cold. I'd been to make a call on Widow Redmond, and the poor soul was out of wood. By the way, farmer, the first thing after sunrise, I want you to be sure to gear up your ox team and take a cord of your best hickory and pitch pine to the widow. And who'll pay me? Asked the farmer doubtfully. I will, to be sure, answered Israel. Have not I got money enough? Here, hold your hand. And he put a handful of silver in the farmer's honest palm. And you, Mr. Wilkins, he added, addressing the butcher, take her the best turkey you've got and half a pig with my compliments and a happy new year to her. Going to A Christmas Carol. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. I should hope I did, replied the lad. An intelligent boy, said Scrooge, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one? What, the one as big as me? Returned the boy. What a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now, replied the boy. Is it? Said Scrooge. Go and buy it. Walker, exclaimed the boy. No, no, said Scrooge. I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off half so fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be. That would be a typical reference for Matthew, but you could apply that to Dickens as well. But you can see the similarities in these two passages. And I mean, really literary comparisons, not even just the idea. Now, this is the last paragraph, the concluding paragraph of the New Year's Bells, and I'm going to compare it to the next to last paragraph of A Christmas Carol, which for many reasons I believe was the original last paragraph of A Christmas Carol, and then Dickens tacked on the concluding paragraph, which doesn't make any sense if you look at it. In Dickens' last paragraph, as I recall it, he talks about Scrooge swearing off spirit contact. Well, this was co-authored by someone who was an advocate of spirit contact, basically a spiritualist, an early spiritualist. She would never have had the main character swearing off all contact with spirits. These were spirit guides. Abby would have advocated that people contact their spirit guide. So that was clearly Dickens, who was kind of pandering to the public, because the public would be a little nervous. The Christians would be a little nervous about all this spirit contact. So he made sure to couch it as a ghost story. It was just fantasy. And he made sure at the end that everybody understood that Scrooge wasn't going to have anything more to do with spirits, that he was renouncing them like one would renounce alcohol. That was Dickens at the end. Now I'm going to read what used to be the real end of A Christmas Carol in comparison with the real end of the New Year's Bells. And remember what I said, that since in writing A Christmas Carol, they're actually drawing from a template, something they'd written before, they can pull in actual phrases from it. They're not afraid of, really duplicating certain, linguistic elements. So in the New Year's Bells, the story ends, Israel was as good as his word and never relapsed into his old habits. The widow and the orphan children were provided for by his bounty. He gave liberally to every object of charity. Hospitals, schools, and colleges were the recipients of his bounty. And when he died in the fullness of years, the blessings of old and young followed him to his last resting place in the old churchyard, where he had dreamed the mysterious dream and been awakened to a better life by the pealing of the New Year's bells. Now what used to be the original conclusion of A Christmas Carol. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. Now, I would guess that originally it said Scrooge was as good as his word. I've been through this logic before, but the phrase as good as your word means that you have integrity. It means that you walk the walk and talk the talk and walk the walk. Being better than your word is just a grandiose improvement that it destroys the original meaning. So in my opinion, Dickens changed that. This part about the good a friend, good a master, I don't know if Matthew wrote something like that and Dickens expanded on it. But then this part about people laughing to see the alteration in him. This is a case where Matthew and Abby are projecting their own personal experience onto this paragraph because they were ahead of their time and they were laughed at and persecuted for being ahead of their time. And Matthew, being a humorist, his approach, and a Stoic philosopher, his approach to these things was just to laugh it off. And, if they're going to be that ignorant, they might as well laugh, and smile as frown. See, that's all Matthew projecting his own personal experience. Dickens was a famous author that everybody applauded and appreciated and loved, see? So he wasn't persecuted at all. It was exactly the reverse. It doesn't fit with the character Scrooge because although initially people might have been amused to see Scrooge dancing around and saying the ghosts of, did it all in one night, he's talking the long run. He lives to a, ripe old age or whatever. And in the long run, nobody would have been laughing at Scrooge for being a nice guy and a reformed guy. It would have been just the opposite. So it doesn't make any sense for Charles Dickens, and it doesn't make any sense for the character Ebenezer Scrooge. It's sheer projection on Matthew's part. It's pretty obvious that they start out with the same phrase. And I think it was literally the same phrase because I found another story by Mathew that starts out the same way. He was as good as his word. So there's two that Mathew wrote that start out that way. And I'm guessing this one also started out that way. And Dickens thought making him better than his word would be an improvement on being as good as his word. So he's betrayed his lack of understanding of integrity, see, because Dickens didn't have integrity. So it didn't mean anything to him. That phrase, being as good as your word, didn't mean anything to him, so might as well ramp it up and say he was better than his word. So there you have it. There's probably more parallels. Those are the ones I pulled out, and they're pretty stark. I think it's pretty obvious that, that Mathew and Abby were the original authors of A Christmas Carol. I have way more evidence. This is just scratching the surface of the evidence that I have. I just wanted to show that when I say that there are parallels between A New Year's Bells and A Christmas Carol, and now that there are parallels between what's supposed to be Charles Dickens' precursor and these earlier works by Mathew and Abby, that it's pretty obvious that Dickens was the imitator and the plagiarist and not the original author of these works.